Thank you so much for having me. I have not looked at my thesis project in a while. It's not as long ago as some of your speakers, but 2012. So yeah, I did though, even before the invitation, had a couple of moments where I was reminded of my thesis. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk a little bit about putting this presentation together and the sort of seeds and trying to connect the dots to two projects in particular that I'm going to show today. So quarantine talks. I really like it. I mean, yes, it is 5 a.m., but I do really like that there's a moment where we can all get out of our heads and are forced to do so. Even some might call it aggressive introverts like me need that in these times. So in the spirit of this, as I said, I'm gonna show two thoughts or two things I'm looking at right now that made me remember my thesis and maybe even the later projects. So one is what I'm reading right now, which is Empire of Vision. It's a little bit older book, 2014, but as me and my partner are focusing on how new media, imaging technologies, pictorial practices affect our vision-oriented subjectivity and what this means for the built environment, how we experience it, how we reassemble it, assemble it, I've become increasingly interested in the oftentimes asymmetrical relationships between who's seeing what and who's been seen and who dictates how we see things. And maybe along those lines, it's one of those things that popped up is, for example, Mitchell's idea of picture theory. So as he says, quote, a complex interplay between visuality, apparatus, institutions, discourses, bodies, and figurality. That was one of the things that reminded me of my thesis, and these are these other things. I'm in Germany right now. These are happening all over the world. I'm sure a lot of you are either there or looking at those. So during my quarantine in Germany, this month I looked at a lot of these images. This is one on the Black Lives Matter protest in Berlin on the Alexanderplatz. It actually, Berlin called it Black Lives Matter / racism exists or against racism. So these protests were obviously in support and solidarity of the racial injustice that has been happening in the US, but they also started another conversation about what is and has been going on in Germany, because racism comes to a surprise to some Germans, but it's not only happening somewhere else, and to other people, but also here. And then a lot of these popped up on my social media feed. They're tracking neo-Nazi movements. Obviously, there's a lot of counter movements, how to be safe, where the counter protest to the counter protest is happening, and how are these mapped out in the city and the site that these protests are happening. So for anyone familiar with this particular city, Berlin, where reconstruction and city planning also means selective memory of a painful past, these maps also highlight the ways cities can become accomplice and or victim in practices of singular point of views and the exclusion of minorities. So my thesis's site was exactly here. And maybe just to take a step back and looking at the projects that I'm going to talk about today, and maybe the questions that kind of started during my thesis at SCI-Arc, but also kind of go through some of these other projects. I'm going to talk obviously about my thesis and then 2 other projects that I developed after. Obviously, English is not my first language, but I do try to capture some of these blurry issues that I'm interested in through project titles. These are 3 project titles. At first glance, they might not have that much in common, but they do challenge or try to challenge preconceived ideas of quality or value. What is the norm and who decides what the norm is? And in my opinion, at least, they invoke an unstable relationship towards matter, place, and identity. All right, Bastardized Gestalt was the title of my thesis. Elena Manfredini was my thesis advisor. I'm not going to talk all about my thesis prep, but I do want to mention that some moments in my thesis prep where it felt like kill your darling can come back. I did write and publish a piece on Schinkel's Bauakademie and reconstruction practices in Berlin based on this. This felt very important for my thesis prep project, and I had to let it go to a certain degree. It's an image by out of Calwer's seminal essay, Mimicry and Legendary Psychasthenia, if you're not familiar with that. My thesis at that point during thesis prep was called The Schizophrenic Gestalt, so the crisis between the self and its sense of place. And while I was still interested in understanding the implications for architecture and site, in particular when it comes to types of suffocating contextualism, I decided to switch to bastard, which is not a disease, but pertains to a social construct, a fictitious impurity that is decided from top down. The other word, right, Gestalt, in my thesis title, I looked intensively into Gestalt principles, the history of Gestalt principles, and while this one, for example, is a lot of the big players, one of them, Max Wertheimer, who published this dot essay, where he started to try to understand how we see order or what is orderly, and how one can map that out through points. In my interest in Gestalt principles, never concerned with what might have been the goal of some of the Bauhaus players who followed this, who might have been, and historians are not necessarily convinced by this or in agreement, but influenced by Wertheimer's studies, but maybe more the unstable one, the one that is on the verge of becoming, that is not something, that doesn't want to be orderly. And in that way, I started looking more into sort of experiments where this thing collapses on itself. So I was looking, and still am, for ways to create principles of unstableness rather than clarity. So Weber-Fechners cloud experiment, for example, where 2 clouds just noticeably different in grayness are observed through smoked glass, they cease to be indistinguishable. Or again, to be assumed be influenced by Gestalt theory or Gestalt psychology, but taking it a little bit further, Paul Klee studies on the interstitial or the outerstitial, or how these things start to collapse on one another. Another Bauhaus player that also became important in terms of how I started to think about materiality and ritual points in space that move fluidly to lines, planes, and volume, and through that, towards material hybrids. So this one, for example, by Annie Albers, starts to incorporate metal threads to experiment with multivalent readings between subject and observer. So again, site, right? At the time of my thesis, this was an empty lot. Now there's like a sort of like cardboard copy of the Baroque castle there, but the empty lot is in the center of Berlin, or was in the center of Berlin, and it contained the memory of two demolished buildings from the past that stood for a particular political but also social moment in time. So one was a Baroque castle, the other one was a brutalist, the brutalist palace of the Republic. And in that way, the potential building elevations, the way they were positioned towards east and west, really address a historical conflict between what building authorities decide and utilize architecture should be or should select, should act towards selective memory of the city. I swear that's almost the last book scan that I'm gonna throw in here, but this one I found useful for the way of how I wanted to approach this project. So in a city that is full of monuments and trying really hard to tell one story and one narrative to a very diverse group of people, I found Frederick Torreson's description of relics versus monuments particularly helpful to formulated my goal of a flickering relic rather than a monolithic monument. So he says, quote, "As opposed to the monument, the relic is no obedient servant. The relic is a turncoat representing different things to different people. It often can symbolize the exact opposite for two separate individuals," unquote. So in that sense, this is was an old a postcard from the Baroque castle. This was a postcard from the brutalist palace of the Republic. I was looking at something that can inhabit both at the same time, and I did a bunch of digital studies at first that then turned into 2.5D studies, looking into weaving strategies, like 2.5D weaving strategies of these two typologies. And then moving into what this would be in 3D. These obviously still drawings, but they're based on 3D models, starting to deal with ideas of flickering. This was the final sort of setup of these drawings. It took particular care on the different kind of elevations and how they start to invoke different kind of aspects of the two projects. What seemed kind of like an obsession with representation at the time, I got really concerned about printing drawings on gold material, on at the time I think it was car vinyl. But it also had something to do with ultimately how the installation reads to others. So it's how to start thinking about the possibility of a project not just looking inwards, but using the way the material starts shining through to attempt going back to the unorderly servant, the relic-like play with the observer. So in this particular project, not in all my projects, but in this particular project, the models are the only moment you see the project in 3D. And they're intentionally constructed in a frail manner. kind of start seeing them as play with light and shadow, but also in the way they start to challenge weight and they start to challenge temporality. So in the documentation that I took of the model, it was somewhat important that the dust settles or things come out of the 3D print, and what does that mean? And how do you create a sort of affect through those models that the drawings might have not contained? All right. This is a little bit later, but as Hernán said, I did work myself around the planet a little bit. I worked in LA, then I worked in China, then I went back to Europe, and ultimately I started teaching back in the US, and I won the Harry de Bogosian Fellowship in 2016, which is a teaching and research fellowship. And my research year was concerned with what I called Ichness. First called it grayness, then I called it Ichness. And it was a series of projects that's similar to some of the aspects I explored in my thesis. When it comes to case of the familiar or rather defamiliar, I see it as a flickering state of being, of belonging, but never actually being. So ish, for example, greenish is not green, will never be green, but it's almost like green. It's adjacent to green in order to create associations with its observer, with whoever interacts with it, but it will always have its own identity. And what does that mean in architectural terms? What does that mean in formal terms? The investigation started with an idea of grayness. So as nowadays the seer and the seen is not only us, but also the world of machines, it seems logical to begin to include them in our explorations. So machine vision is instrumental in the construction of our contemporary visual language and the transformation of ever-growing data sets of partial images in three-dimensional machine-readable survey models, and how they're affecting subjects and objects alike. So the work here that was actually published on off-ramp for an essay that I wrote on the tolerance issue. It's an excerpt of studies that begins to speculate on seeing or machine seeing by embracing a lack of focus. So these Google images were utilized through or selected through the Google algorithm. So they simulate the illusion of what we see through multiplication, depending on the contrast of the first image, in this case, Warhol's Coca-Cola bottle. The process would happen fast or slow, but inevitably it would end in gray, cloudy matter, clouds in this case. The final project was called Marble-ish. So the so-called Marble Room is the School of Architecture's exhibition space, and Marble-ish was the final part of the inaugural Harry de Bogosian Fellowship. And it started thinking about how, while traditional scanning projects understand their output as absolute truth, how can we start to focus on the misreadings, on the in-betweens? It's important to mention that this was a team effort. It was not just me reading these machine outputs. A ginormous group of students who started to analyze the scans almost as found objects that they started to do formal analysis on, that they usually would have done with canonical architectural precedents. Syracuse University, right? So it was a lot of work went into trying to understand how they see it versus how I see it versus how the scanner sees it. So through a variety of these digital operations, the installation is transformed into an active landscape, which questions the scanner's ability to accurately document and produce a picturing of the real, and maybe producing more of a multiplicity. So the drawings of this exhibition produced a couple of artifacts. These model drawings that attempt to find connections in the drawings for three-dimensional form making, and these drawing models that are printed with the 3D paper printer. So in themselves, they're really just layered drawings. So in opposition to the similar, the installation allows us to speculate on many new depictions of the real, all brought together in a single mediated space. I would like to note that while we usually show this project through videos, I decided to show it through this little side project that we did, where the students documented the installation the way they wanted it to see, the way they wanted to start thinking about it. And then this one is the last one, which, yeah, I did note or mention the word clouding or blurriness a lot. So clouds was the exhibition that my partner and I did last fall 2019. While the starting point were three projects that are in various building phases in our practice right now, the installation in itself is focusing on the image and its various material manifestations. I lied, there's one more quote, but I think then it was that. I like this quote by Hito Steyerl a lot when it comes to sort of moving through the materiality of images, where she says, quote, "A transitional space that allows people to enter and exit images, to freeze and become images, and then leave the state of flatness again and go somewhere else," unquote. So really, the exhibition tried to leverage the ephemeral byproduct of scanning technologies, point clouds, image making, machine seeing, to explore three discarded sites across the basic building materials: stone, wood, metal, with three elemental form making strategies: line, plane, volume. And as a way to begin to inhabit these design investigations situated between hyperreal photography and gaming aesthetics, these image worlds connect the digital content of the initial scans with their projective design. So multiple narratives are embedded here into the construction of these images through the insertion of various levels of resolution. The elements they depict. The high resolution scan sites are treated as background, point clouds, temporary snapshots of the environment that the project now inhabits. And bike seats, wildflowers, ants, entourage are standing in with high resolution materialities, foregrounding narratives of human, non-human alike. So the space in between these two conditions is occupied by these architectural interventions, off-center, partaking in this conversation, jumping in and out of focus. So a focus for us were these three models that we produced, engaging with three different materialities: glass, stone, steel. The models are not intended to operate, obviously, as direct representation of their respective design, but they're rather attempt to renegotiate basic architectural formal strategies. So again, what is line, plane, volume? What is materiality really in the realm of the digital? And how do we use them to articulate spatial interventions for these complex scanned sites? So more simply, how to develop a conversation between known architectural elements and the endlessly detailed data sets of 3D scanned environments towards linear extrusions, negotiating the often ribbed edge conditions, or progressive layers of ink, or stratification of the physical points. Like the last model that we really spent the most time on, we experimented with a 3D printer in Italy who actually uses actual sand out of the Romagna Emilia area where the project is, and actually 3D prints rock or rock strata. So how do you start to capture the sort of volatile nature of that rock and of what the materialization of this the series of points could be. The overview or the sort of tying element was important for us as well. So the digitally captured environments of these three sites are distributed in the space of the gallery. And in a copy-paste operation, they multiply between design interventions and leveraging immersive imaging technologies through these 360 videos that we distributed in the space. So the little viewpoints and the little moments that we usually show in animations, but I also kind of like them as stills. And then ultimately, again, it starts to address how these VR environments that are ultimately just experienced through one's iPhone layered on top over the actual physical things in the space ties the space back together, but also allows for everyone's reading to be a little bit different. And what does that mean in terms of a flickering between what we as architects want or speculate on versus the observer or the user? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. Fantastic lecture, and the work looks exquisite, and it's great to see the evolution and take it up a notch and a notch and a notch in terms of the sophistication of it, and in terms of also the resources of the potential of how the discourse expand. So maybe to get us going, so and then people can ask or put questions in the chat. First of all, I can't believe it already has been 8 years since you finished this. Time flies. But one thing it was, and I want to go back a little bit to the beginning of your talk in relation to the work, because I think is in the times that we live, and I think these are one of the big challenges for us moving forward, is because I think the work that you're doing is incredibly radical and sophisticated in terms of the design. But at the same time, I mean, like in your thesis, there was a kind of a political dimension, and to me, it's an interesting challenge that we're all going to be faced. We are all confronted with in how we start to put the things together, and what are. And I think the issue that also you with virtual reality and augmented reality and the multiple dimensions of it, and the potential that architecture has today. I realize it's no more of a question, it's more for you the chance to elaborate on that and how you think how that's been evolving, because as I said, as fantastic as your thesis was, and it still is, the more recent work, it takes on that and it keeps pushing it even further in terms of how the representation can also has a direct correlation with the political dimension. And so I would like, if you can, to elaborate a little bit further, how do you think that can keep evolving within your own agenda?
Yeah, it's definitely still a work in progress. I think that's why I threw the book references in there, because I'm still trying to figure out how one operates as sort of visual aesthetic practice, but also start to address political issues equally. And to me, at least, there's incredible potential in the way I start also teaching with my students to start to allow for that to happen and allow for that conversation to happen. Like, what does it mean to create an awareness with your students that yes, canon exists and they're all white dudes, and let's talk about why that is and how that is, and then let's also talk about all the other things and put those on the table and see where we land with that. I don't actually know where we land with that, but I'm interested in the possibilities that new media gives us with that. There's obviously a lot of possibility for neo-Nazis to organize themselves over Twitter as well, but ultimately, yeah. I think we have the responsibility as a visual practice or as an aesthetic practice to keep up and actually be better than them.
Yeah, and also to understand the unlimited potential of aesthetics also as a political tool, right?
Yeah.
If anybody else have a question, you can jump in or write it in the chat, however you feel more comfortable, and you put in the chat. I'm happy to read it to Maya. But I see a lot of familiar faces there. So if not, I can keep talking with Maya, but I want to give the chance for everybody else to use this time.
Hi, Maya. I'll ask my question. That was a really great talk. It was so cool. The kind of recent work was really sort of spellbinding. Those images were like so amazing to kind of finally see someone who could like use the kind of 3D scanned like junk and really elevate it. I also loved what you were saying about the model as kind of architecturalizing or sort of trying to work with the volatile nature of the sort of geologic object. Could you talk more about that volatility and how maybe your process of kind of architecturalizing that worked?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously something that my partner Daniela and I have been working on for a while. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think we're not the only ones. I think there's a lot of people out there who are using scans. I think there's a lot of people out there who are just using them to represent what like this one true thing. And I think the potential of the volatile, the model, the digital model, the movies, it is going back to kind of the original ideas of my thesis. How do you start to allow for not just one thing? Like what would that mean in build form? Like if at the simplest, it would just mean something that looks from this elevation like this, looks different like this, but where do you start thinking about potential of resolution, which, I mean, yeah, I guess the sort of like ideas of distinction and boundaries, and how do you start determining them is much more challenged with that. And I mean, there's obviously, and I mean, again, like we're not obviously the only ones who are doing that, but there's a huge potential in letting that go and actually not making a clear outline out of it and saying, here you go, incredibly high resolution scan, let's put it on an incredibly powerful server, and that's it, because we cannot do anything with it. So actually starting to understand the sort of misreadings and holds and the things that degrade from the model, from the stone model, as a potential to think about new things that happen of it. I mean, also for us, it has something to do that we all of these projects are essentially adaptive reuse is such an overused word, but they are based on existing conditions, and these existing conditions are not necessarily what everyone would think are valuable. So so it also allows for starting to speculate on how to expand on that.
Thanks, Maya. I think I agree. The recent images are just amazing. I love those. The scanned and the different kinds of resolutions, and you feel like you're slipping from one world into another. And it seems to me the sort of arc that you've created between your earlier work, looking at Roger Calois and the legendary Psychasthenia text, and the idea of flickering and boundary connects to this. I mean, I wish you could talk, or I would like you to talk a little bit more about this ish, the ISH, and how that might relate to some contemporary discussions about identity and identity politics.
I mean, yeah, for one, I think the need of belonging, right, has something to do with that, right? I mean, the contemporary conversations on, I just got distracted by the dog. The contemporary conversations around, for example, what's happening with the protests in Berlin, and me having to explain to people that it's not necessarily always okay to ask people where they're really from. Is related to our inherent need to form categories and not necessarily challenge them, right? So, which ultimately ties back to the original idea of Gestalt psychology was to just figure that one out and then be done with it. And I think the potential for me is to say sure, our brains operate through categories, but I think actually understanding this more as a space of negotiation rather than two spaces that are binary has a huge potential in terms of what identity politics deal with right now, but also how architecture start to have a conversation in there in terms of what are the figural and pictorial proposals that can come out of that. I don't know if I answered your question, Marcelin, but I tried.
I think you did, and I appreciate the reference to Empires of Vision. I'm going to pick that up.
Anybody else?
I could ask a question. Hi, Maya.
Hi.
Thank
Should
you.
I be scared, David? Is it going to be a mean one again?
What do you mean again? What was it? What are you talking about? It was a wonderful lecture, and the work is fantastic. And I was just trying to think, like, maybe about two things. Like, it was really nice to hear you talk about the Gestalt kind of moving into the Ish project and then the cloud. I was thinking, as you were describing them, like the difference between, let's say, ambiguity and things that are kind of in a third space, but are definitively in a third space, let's say. Like ambiguous language maybe produces things that are unclear and allows confusion to reign forth, let's say. There's a kind of a way for like a political project to be ambiguous allows us to not see where power clearly comes from, let's say. And like in what you're describing, it seems not so much about that kind of thing. It seems to instead be like making a space which is outside of like those maybe two binary choices that you see in the Gestalt. What I liked, like I was thinking as you were describing the clouds, like if you had said it was about fog would be maybe more the former. Fog would be the one that was, things are foggy, unclear, unsure. Clouds are like above you, they're far away. You can still see them and identify them as such in a way. And I was curious, like when you guys make like drawings and models and images and whatever else you're making, you know, like some of them seem like, and I think I forget the words you use, like you call them like drawing models or something. Like some of them are kind of always in the middle, but there's definitely some things that are like 2-dimensional, some things that are 3-dimensional, some things that look like you can see through them to something else that's bigger, and some things that seem just the things themselves. I'm curious about like how that like third space, or in like not ambiguous, but let's say in betweenness of things, kind of shows up in when you make these images or when you think of materials. And you know, like should we understand them to be like, oh no, that's definitely a model, or that's definitely an object, or that's definitely a mix of the two? Like, or are you preferring these things to always be kind of still in this space of uncertain, you know, like they can't get labels just quite yet?
I mean, I'm not 100% sure if I can give you an actual explanation on how we do things. I think Daniela is more strategic. I'm more like, but in terms of the sort of conceptual backing of it, I do love when Samuel Beckett talks about grayness. He talks about it as an actual thing that contains a story, not like a vague thing, an actual a thing that is always there and is always close and it's always on the verge of becoming, or it always contains something. But it doesn't, it's more of a fluid moving from one to the other one. I mean, ultimately, I mean, for architectural projects, in the sense of the house, for example, we obviously also have drawings of those, but we also produce these other drawings that then kind of like become more slippages and intentional slippages. And in themselves, to me at least, they're more the project, because they can contain all of the above. So I guess the strategy for us is, what do you do with the data flow, like all the data overflow, and actually start to embrace it and start to think about what the sort of representational or aesthetic strategies are that come out of that. And yeah, but I don't know if we have like an actual strategy for how to make these. I think they become more containers of slippages, of betweenness. But I agree with you. I don't think they want to be avoid to give answers like I do right now. I think they want to be more, they know what's happening, and they're making a choice of positioning themselves in the in-between.
Maya, again, thank you. The lecture is spectacular. The work is looking better and better. Very much looking forward to have you back in the school in person, or to see you somewhere in some place. And again, and talk to you again. I really appreciate waking up this early to share with everybody here your work. And anyway, have a good morning for you. And take care of your dog.
All right. Good to see everyone. Stay safe.
That was great, Maya.
Bye.
Thank you.